with Surds, which is on rationalizing the denominator. So when working with fractions, if the denominator, which is the bottom number, has a surd on it, then you must rationalize the denominator. Now what that means is that you want to get rid of the square root sign so that you just have a whole number on the bottom of your fraction. That makes it easier then if you want to do further calculations by adding fractions together and so on. So looking at the dot points, if the fraction has a single surd in the denominator, multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the surd. Okay, and I'll be showing you an example of that in the middle in a minute. The second dot point says if the fraction has two terms in the denominator, then you multiply both the top and the bottom by what we call the conjugate. Now that's a bit of a fancy word, but what that means is the conjugate, when you have two terms on the bottom of a fraction, you're multiplying by the exact same thing, but you change the sign in between them. So for example, if I had something like square root of a plus square root of b, then the conjugate that I'm multiplying by is square root of a minus square root of b. So it's exactly the same, but I've changed the plus sign into a minus sign. Okay? There are three main types of questions that we're going to be looking at, and these I've made a list here for you to list what the three types are. Type number one is when the denominator only has a surd on the bottom of it. The method, what you need to do is to multiply the top and the bottom of the fraction by that lone surd that's on the bottom. So an example of this type of question is 1 over root 2. There's only that lone square root of 2 on the bottom, so I just need to multiply that by square root of 2 over square root of 2. Now, I'm not going to do the whole question here. I'm not going to multiply those together yet. It's just practice finding out what we're going to multiply by. Let's look at type number 2. In this type, the denominator has a surd with a number in front of it. So to do this, you're going to multiply the top and the bottom of the fraction just by the surd part. Do not include the number in front of the surd. So for example, this one here, we have root 3 over 5 root 2. So the only change between this question and the first one is in that instead of just having the root 2 by itself, I now have a number in front of it. Don't worry about the surd on top, okay? We're not worried about what's happening on the top at this stage. We're trying to rationalize the denominator, which is the bottom. So all I do is I take the square root sign on the bottom, which is square root of 2, and I multiply by square root of 2 over square root of 2. Okay, and we'll continue those ones down below to multiply them out. The third type of question, which is the longest one, is when the denominator has two terms in it. Okay, so you can see this example down here. We've got a root 2 minus 5. There is two terms on the bottom there. When this happens, we multiply the top and the bottom by the conjugate. Okay, so remember the conjugate is exactly what's on the bottom, but with the opposite sign. So for this first example over here, the 3 over root 2 minus 5, I multiply by the root 2 plus 5 over root 2 plus 5. I'm just changing the middle sign. Okay, there is another one here. It looks a little bit more involved. There's certainly a lot more numbers in there, but all we have to do is multiply by the conjugate, which is whatever's on the bottom. So 3 root 2, but I'm going to change it to plus 5 root 3 over the same thing. Alright, so let's do the full questions now in the examples. I want to simplify 1 over root 2, which means I want to rationalize the denominator. Okay, so I have one surd on the bottom. This is type 1. I'm going to multiply by root 2 over root 2. Okay, now I want to actually finish the question this time. So to multiply fractions, we multiply the tops together. 1 times root 2 is root 2. And on the bottom, root 2 times root 2 will cancel the square root out, and we'll just have a 2 on the bottom, making the nice whole number for the denominator that I was after. Alright, that question's done. Let's do part B. So again, just looking at the denominator, I have a square root of 5. So to rationalize that, I'm going to have to multiply by square root of 5 over square root of 5. Okay, now to multiply, we multiply the tops together. 3 is the only whole number at the front, so that will stay there. But to multiply the surds, I multiply the numbers underneath. 2 times 5 is 10. On the bottom, square root of 5 times square root of 5, the square roots disappear, and I just end up with 5. Part C. I've already written this down there for you. I'll write that again. So we have, on the bottom there, we have a 4 root 2, but we don't need to multiply by the 4. We just take the square root part. So we're multiplying by square root of 2 over square root of 2. Okay, and then we multiply. Multiplying the top, I have a 3, and 5 times 2 is 10. On the bottom, I have a 4 that is not a surd, but the root 2 times the root 2, square root disappears, will become a 2. Now I just need to times those numbers together on the bottom. So 3 root 10 on the top, and 4 times 2 is 8 for the bottom. Always check to see if you can simplify. So if these numbers here simplify, but these ones don't. So we're ready for the next question. For D, you'll notice that there are now 2 terms on the bottom of that fraction. So this is the third type of question where we need to multiply by the conjugate. So the conjugate is whatever's on the bottom, but change the sign so it becomes a minus over 3 minus root 2. Now when you multiply these, you have to imagine that each of these things are in brackets because you want to multiply both parts. So on the top, I need to do 5 times 3, which is 15, and 5 times minus root 2, which is minus 5 root 2. On the bottom, we need to expand like we've got 2 brackets here. It would be a FOIL expansion. Now, hopefully you look at that and you go, well, the brackets are the same, but one's a plus and one's a minus. It's a difference of 2 squares, and the middle 2 terms will cancel out. So you can use the short method to expand this, which is just to multiply the first ones together and multiply the last ones together. However, if you don't remember that, then you can just do a full FOIL expansion as normal. And I'll do that to show you. So doing the full FOIL expansion, I do 3 times 3 is 9. So that's the first. Then the outside, 3 times minus root 2 is minus 3 root 2. Then the inside, root 2 times 3 is 3 root 2. And then last, root 2 times minus root 2 makes minus, square roots disappear, 2. Then we can't simplify anything on the top, so we have 15 minus 5 root 2. On the bottom, see how we have minus 3 root 2 plus 3 root 2? They will cancel out, and they should always cancel out, which is how our surds disappear from our denominator. Because all that's left then is 9 take away 2, which is 7. Okay, so instead of doing the full FOIL expansion like I said, we could have just done the first one to get that, and the last ones together to get that. And last one, part E. I have 2 fractions that I want to add together. Now, before I can do that, I'm going to have to rationalize the denominator of both of them. So, the first one, I have 5 on the bottom, so root 5 on the bottom. To rationalize that, I'm going to times by root 5 over root 5. Plus, now doing the second fraction, I start with root 2 over 4 root 3. To rationalize that one, it's just the root 3 on the bottom, so times by root 3 over root 3. Now, taking the first part, I'm going to multiply those fractions together. 2 times root 5 is 2 root 5. On the bottom, square root 5 times square root 5 just becomes a 5. Now, looking at the second half of the question, multiplying those fractions together, square root 2 times square root 3 is square root of 6. 2 times 3 is 6, just multiplying the numbers underneath. On the bottom, the 4 is at the front, but we multiply square root 3 times square root 3 to get a whole number 3. Okay, I just want to simplify the second fraction. So 2 root 5 over 5 and square root of 6, I just want to change the 4 times 3 to become a 12. Now that I have nice whole numbers on the bottom of my fractions, I could add those two fractions together, which would be better, wouldn't it, than having two fractions. We're trying to simplify here. So I want to get a common denominator. The easiest way to do that is to times 5 by 12, which is 60. Then I need to adjust my numerators, so I'm going to multiply diagonally. 2 root 5 times 12 is going to make 24 square root 5. And then multiplying the other way diagonally, 5 times root 6 is 5 root 6. And the plus sign goes in between. And that's actually as far as I can take this question. You always need to look out for things that can simplify further, but there's nothing else in here that I can simplify, so we're done.